So I know I'm a little bit late here to the party in terms of talking about Starfield, but it's a big game, I have a job and other responsibilities, so give me a break. Anyway, I recently finished Starfield, and to be honest, I don't think I've ever felt as conflicted about a game ever that I can recall anyway. So I've been kind of marinating on my thoughts and yeah, felt the need to get them out there and try and form some sort of actual cohesive opinion about this game, because even sitting here right now, I still don't really know how I feel about it, and I've been thinking about it for weeks at this point, and it's starting to drive me slowly insane. So I'm about to unburden myself on all of you. Ooh, I hope that didn't sound too creepy. So for those of you who have been living under a rock, Starfield is the latest game from Bethesda Game Studios, the masterminds behind the Elder Scrolls series, and the sort of stewards of the modern iteration of Fallout. Starfield represents Bethesda's first new IP in a long time, and their first stab at the sci-fi genre. So that, combined with people, myself included, reverence for Elder Scrolls and Fallout, meant that Starfield was one of the most anticipated games in recent history. When it launched, I would say the response from what I've seen was pretty divided. Some people consider it the second coming, whereas sites like IGN and GameSpot gave it 7s, which by their metric is just good, quote unquote. You know, for context, there's been a lot of games this year that scored higher than it, like Tears of the Kingdom, Baldur's Gate 3, even like Diablo 4 and Sea of Stars have all scored higher than it. So in consideration against the amount of hype that was surrounding it, it could arguably be seen as a disappointment if you care about things like Metacritic scores, which I personally don't. I guess for context, I played Starfield immediately at launch. I eventually put it down after about 100 hours. I'd finished my first playthrough and I started a little ways down the path of doing New Game Plus just because I wanted to see what that was actually like, before eventually kind of falling off of it at that stage and moving on to some other things. So I would say I probably had what I would consider to be a fairly typical player experience, right? I beat the game, spent a lot of fucking time with it, and went a little bit beyond that as well, which I think for games like this is fairly standard, I would say. So Starfield begins very much in your typical Bethesda fashion. You create a character and events happen to your character which quickly sort of turn their world upside down, and they are thrust into a sort of chosen one type narrative, where they embark on a quest that will decide the fate of the universe. I have more affinity to Elder Scrolls than Fallout, I would say, so in drawing comparisons, I'm going to probably talk about Elder Scrolls more. So like in Skyrim, you become the Dragonborn and you're the only one that can sort of save the world from Alduin. There's very much a similar kind of angle here. Your character very quickly becomes sort of special in a way that makes them unique in this world and very important to the centre of big events that are happening. As part of this sort of narrative, you join an organisation called Constellation, who are these sort of spacefaring explorers dedicated to uncovering the secrets of the universe. Specifically, they are currently engaged in this quest to hunt down these mysterious artifacts that they can't explain. I think this initial setup's a little clunky, to be honest. I came away feeling slightly odd at how Constellation basically just invite you into their ranks and more or less entrust their mission to you without knowing anything about you, and also particularly when they already have another member and a character called Barrett, who's the first person from Constellation you meet, who has already done the thing that happened to you that makes you special. So they've already got someone that they know and trust that fills your role. So it just felt a bit ham-fisted to me. And that's kind of a theme throughout. I feel like there's a lot of characters in this game don't act and respond to things and react the way that you would think a normal person would in certain scenarios, and I think your introduction to Constellation's very much the kind of first example of this. That being said, at the start of the game, my overall feeling was one of wonder and anticipation and excitement, such that I was prepared to overlook the perhaps slightly ham-fisted way that it gets you to that stage. The other members of Constellation are who you will spend the majority of your time in the game with. You'll generally speaking pick one of them to follow you around on your adventures and act as a sort of companion, similar to what you could do in things like Elder Scrolls and Fallout, and you can sort of change between them at almost any time, with the exception of there are certain story missions where a specific companion needs to be with you. And as you progress through the game, your relationships with these characters becomes closer, you learn more about their past, you deepen your friendship with them. There are obviously romantic options, you can even get married to some of the members of Constellation. Sadly, you don't get to the more these character relationships progress, the more I think Starfield starts to show its flaws. A lot of your interactions and how your relationships progress feels really unnatural to me. Part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that all your conversations still take place in that old Bethesda style, where the camera zooms in on the person's face and they stand largely static as you talk to them, and only really their face moves, and it's just really weird. And then you still have the instances where there'll be other characters like walking around in the background that will walk right into your face as you're in the middle of an important conversation, or be freaking out on some piece of background scenery that they're stuck on, and it just completely ruins some of it. In my playthrough, I chose to marry one of the members of Constellation, and even your wedding scene takes place in that same style. Like, for me, and the way it happened, the way it worked was I was standing out in a section of the open world on a planet, just out in the open, with me, my betrothed, and two other characters who were attending this ceremony. And it was just a conversation in that zoomed in perspective, switching between the characters the same as every other interaction in the game. And it just felt really just dated and underwhelming. What made it worse for me is I was standing in a slightly awkward angle when I triggered that conversation. So like, the character that I was being married to was kind of side on to me and craning their head backwards to look at me, and it just felt so off. It's such a shame because some of the members of Constellation are really interesting, and their stories and their past and the things you learn about them are so engaging. And I felt that, you know, the relationship I had with the character that I end up marrying was really sweet and meaningful, but a lot of the interactions are just ruined by this shit dated way in which the game still handles conversations. And another issue tied to that is the pace at which these relationships develop. I don't know, I never quite managed to work out whether it was tied to like in-game XP or in-game time that passes, or some combination of both. But basically, after doing something in the world for an amount of time, you'll get a little quest notification that says X character wants to speak to you, or you'll walk past them and they'll say, hey, can I have a word with you, please? And that'll be an indication that you've unlocked like another layer, another tier of their either friendship or romance or whatever type of relationship you're pursuing with them. But like, in the case of the character that I ended up marrying, the way that that actually unfolded is I'd met them, we'd had two like vaguely flirty conversations that were like very, very light, and the next interaction that I unlocked with them, my only option was to basically declare my undying love for them when I had known them for 5 minutes and had two conversations. It just feels weird. It feels like a holdover from a bygone era of games where that was just how things had to be done. But times have moved on, and unfortunately Starfield fails to move with them. You compare all this to a game like Cyberpunk, which, you know, say what you want about how it launched, but when you're speaking with characters and interacting with them in meaningful moments, it's actually played out in almost like cutscenes. The characters will fully animate and act physically like human beings when you're talking to them, and the relationships that you have are deliberately paced to play out over the entire game in the context of the wider story. So for instance, in Cyberpunk, there are points where you might think you've reached the end of an NPC's sort of quest chain and they ride away into the sunset, but then later in the game, at a sort of predetermined point, you'll get a phone call from them or a text from them, or you'll be able to phone them and they come back into the story, and then that relationship deepens because the things that are happening to your character, because you consider the NPC a friend, you've called upon them and they've come to help you or whatever. It feels like how a relationship in the real world works, you know, versus, oh, you've hit a certain XP or time threshold, so now you've unlocked another conversation. Again, my overall feeling is that a game like Cyberpunk feels like a modern RPG in this regard, whereas Starfield is stuck in the PS3 360 era, which I think is particularly egregious given that it was marketed as, the next gen RPG. In terms of the main story in Starfield, you'll spend the majority of the main quest sort of hopping about from planet to planet, collecting artifacts to help try and unravel the mystery of them, until eventually in the third act that sort of reveals itself, and then you'll hop about a bit more and finish the game. I think it starts really strongly. I definitely felt absorbed in the kind of central mystery of the world and these artifacts and what was going on. I definitely found myself sort of trying to work things out and yeah, being enthralled by it. So yeah, I think it does start very, very strong. It does have two main problems for me. Firstly, and again, I won't spoil anything here, I think when the mystery does eventually start revealing itself, the answers that the game gives for the questions it raises are just really unsatisfactory. Without spoiling it, it feels like a bit of a kind of video gamey cop-out ending. I just don't like it. I think it actually undermines quite a lot of what you spend your time in the game doing. It sort of trivializes the world and all the people in it that you've interacted with up until this point. And I think after I got over the initial sort of, oh, that was pretty cool, that's fairly unique, I was actually left with the overall feeling that I'd wasted a lot of my time playing the game. Secondly, I think the feeling of you actually adventuring through space, exploring and finding these artifacts is massively undercut by the systems in the game through which you actually achieve that, which is basically just going into your menu and fast traveling. You see, Starfield is not No Man's Sky, not by any stretch. You don't actually ever get in your ship and manually take off and fly away from a planet and then fly to a destination ever, whether, in hyperspace or not. Instead, with rare exception, and unless you specifically go out your way to not do this, you basically just stand on the ground, open your map, press a couple of buttons and you warp to where you need to be. Generally speaking, that's around the sort of atmosphere of a planet, which you then click another button to land on, or if it's a place you've been before, you can just warp, surface to surface and cut out the ship entirely. And when you land on a planet, that plays out in a little cutscene, so you don't even do that manually. So in other words, in a game about space exploration, there is no fucking space exploration. Now, I'm not an idiot. I can understand why Bethesda did this. Firstly, as I said, Starfield is not No Man's Sky. Graphically, it's more advanced. Technically, it's more demanding. So I can understand that, unlike No Man's Sky, it would have been impossible to knit the world of Starfield together in one big, massive open world. Technically, it just is not feasible. And I can see that the way that Bethesda ultimately chose to do it, through, basically letting you fast travel as much as you want, is essentially a quality of life choice for the player. Whilst walking back to your ship and manually taking off and flying somewhere might be fun for the first 5 or 10 hours, at hour 95, when you're just trying to grind to get quests done or whatever, it becomes less fun. And I guess you would be pretty grateful probably for the ability to just press a button and go where the fuck you needed to go. That is, unless you're fucking encumbered and then you can't go anywhere. But that's a separate conversation. However, unfortunately, the reality is that because of this choice, it really undercuts the feeling of scope in Starfield and makes the game world, feel really small. Travelling from one side of charted space to the other to hunt down this artifact should feel like this grand adventure, but it just doesn't when all you're doing is pressing a button and seeing a very quick loading screen and then you're there. And it makes the sort of hunt for these artifacts feel pretty trivial. In addition to the main story, you've obviously got your sort of main side quests, which are the kind of faction quests that you would normally expect to see in a Bethesda game. So the things that are akin to your Dark Brotherhoods and your Thieves Guilds and stuff. In my view, I think the quality of these varies greatly. Again, I won't spoil anything, but there's one faction quest that I thought was quite good, which focuses on the origin of a certain alien species that I thought was pretty fun and interesting. But then there's a faction quest for a company called Eugene Industries, which is basically Starfield's attempt at doing like a cyberpunk sort of corpo storyline. And that's genuinely one of the worst pieces of shit I've ever played in my life. It's so fucking boring and tedious. And I don't know who at Bethesda played this and thought, yeah, that's great, they'll fucking love that. And I guess in my view, even the highs are still not as good as things like your Dark Brotherhood quest or your Thieves Guild quest from Skyrim, or the companions, for example, in Skyrim where you become a fucking werewolf, right? Like, there's nothing, even the good stuff's not on that level. Then there are, of course, a metric shit ton of standalone side quests for you to do. I did quite a few of these early on and sort of less so as I progressed. There was one pretty early called the Mantis. I won't say anything more about it than that I found really good. Probably, you know, potentially one of the best Bethesda side quests you could do, you know, up there with the greats. But as I did more and more of them, I don't think I found any other ones that were that engaging or rewarding or interesting, and I eventually just kind of stopped after a while because most of them were boring me to tears. Most of them are your sort of typical go here, talk to this NPC, come back, or warp to this planet, kill these guys, warp back. Don't get me wrong, that's not entirely dissimilar from the gameplay loop in every other Bethesda game, and I love that loop. However, that's because that loop usually comes hand in hand with leveling up your character, you know, improving your skills, getting cool gear, even just like getting items to sell for gold that you need for things. You know, I sneak my way through endless caves in Skyrim because it's rewarding to level up my sneak and my archery skills so that I can turn myself into a fucking invisible ninja that can one-shot everyone. However, Starfield treats leveling slightly differently from its predecessors, and looking back, I think that negatively impacted how I played the game. So with this being a Bethesda RPG, you obviously still level up your character and improve your skills, but there is a slight revision on the usual formula here. So again, speaking predominantly about Elder Scrolls, normally what you would do is if you want to level up a skill, you just need to use the skill basically. So if you want to become good at one-handed weapons in Skyrim, you just need to hit things with one-handed weapons until your skill goes up. In Starfield, it's slightly different because instead of just needing to use the skill, there are specific challenges that you need to do to unlock the next level of a skill. So for example, if you want to level up your skill in melee weapons, you need to get X number of kills in melee weapons. Then, once you've completed a challenge, you need to spend a perk point that you get from leveling up in order to unlock the next level of the skill. Whereas in Skyrim, for instance, you would perpetually keep leveling up the skill just by using it, regardless of if you never spent any perk or talent points in that tree until obviously you hit max level for the skill. I think this new system worked better for some skills than others. Like a lot of the weapon skills just require you to get kills, which is actually, I think, better than the old way because it means I can see the finite number of things I need to do to level up. Whereas in Skyrim, it was a bit of a more sort of nebulous XP bar that would progress sometimes, and it was difficult to get a sense sometimes for how much you actually needed to do to level up. So I think in instances where it's straightforward, it works pretty well. For example, there was like a skill tied to reload speed that required me to actually empty my magazine before reloading in order to do the challenge. Those were a bit of a pain in the tits compared to say how sneak worked in Skyrim, where all you needed to do was just sneak. I also felt frustrated at times being held back from progressing skills because I had to wait until I leveled up to get a perk point to unlock the next level of the challenge. So basically if I was leveling up pistols, say for example, and I'd already got the amount of kills I needed to complete the pistol kill challenge, until I leveled up and got a perk point to unlock the next level of challenge, all my pistol kills didn't count for shit, basically. And then that kind of snowballed to the extent where I was quickly finding that I had multiple skills where that was true for, where I was waiting on levels up to spend perk points before I could progress any further. And that was hurting my sort of lizard brain min-maxing side, so I ended up playing the game in what was probably a pretty unusual way. Pretty early on, I basically stopped questing and doing anything that meant making meaningful progress through the game until I got to a point where I had unlocked sort of all or most of the skills that I wanted to unlock and built my character out in the way I wanted to. I was really pretty meticulous about it, and that is generally how I approach role-playing games. You know, games like these don't come along all that often, and you can only play them for the first time once, so I'm always pretty paranoid about ruining that first experience. So I generally do everything I can to try and make my character as perfect as they possibly can be. Problem was, as I touched on, because of how skills work in Starfield as opposed to Skyrim, I felt like I wasn't progressing enough just through playing the game naturally to get my characters to where I wanted them to be. So I was worried that I was going to hit like a story beat or a big cool quest and then not be able to kind of resolve that in the way that I wanted to, or in as cool a way as I could have if I'd leveled my character up more. And in turn, I was worried that that would kind of ruin my experience with the game. So because of that, I kind of took progression into my own hands. As I alluded to before, the biggest barrier in my way was getting enough perk points to unlock all the challenges that I wanted to unlock, and then completing the challenges themselves. So to get perk points, I had to basically level up a bunch. So I did this by using the outpost system and more or less abusing it so that I had essentially infinite amounts of iron and aluminium and could just craft infinite things and level up as much as I wanted to. And then when I got bored of doing that, I would go off and actually, you know, do some kind of generic side quests and get some kills and raid some bases and unlock the challenges that I needed to do. And with some of the more involved challenges, it was actually easier to just fucking cheese them than it was to unlock them through playing the game naturally. And then I would rinse and repeat this process until I eventually got my character to where I wanted them. My weird gamer brain actually found just watching those numbers go up as I did kind of menial things pretty satisfying. I would basically cloud stream the game to my laptop, which wasn't capable of running it natively, and do this sort of tedious stuff as I sat and watched TV or something, and it was actually quite a fun way to play, bizarrely. But the main issue with this is it obviously cut out a large part of what I loved about Skyrim, which was actually playing the fucking game. And of course you might say, well, Graham, you could have just not been a weirdo and just played the game naturally, but as I said, I just felt like the progression wasn't satisfying enough doing it normally. So I appreciate Bethesda trying to, you know, make a variation on a theme here instead of just trotting out the same old system. But I think the results were pretty mixed, and in my case, it actually ended up undermining some of my experience with the game. But of course, if you're less of a fucking lizard brain than I am, then that might not bother you as much. And that kind of brings me to my most fundamental issue with Starfield, I think. So the reason that I leveled up my character so meticulously is because I wanted to be placed to have the best experience possible when I eventually progress the main story and the faction quests and get to that point in the game where you start seeing the cool shit, you know? When I came across more quests similar to that Mantis one that would blow my fucking mind, the problem is that just never really happened. The more I played through the sort of main activities in the game, the more I realised there just wasn't really anything there that was cool enough to warrant that level of effort on my part. And then, as I touched on earlier, it would all eventually just be undermined by the game's ending anyway. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact in all of this that at its heart Starfield is a Bethesda game, and as with every Bethesda game, that naturally means there is quite a lot that I enjoyed about it. I enjoyed playing in the sandbox, turning my character into like a murder machine and slaying hordes of space pirates and looting every fucking object in their base and then trudging back to my ship because I was so encumbered that I could barely move. But I think the core issue is that that's it. It is just another Bethesda game. It does nothing really to innovate or improve on that formula when the world of games around it have evolved significantly. You know, just recently we've had games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom that are all pushing the envelope of what we thought was possible, whereas Starfield feels just like more of the same, which might have been cutting edge back in 2011 when Skyrim launched, but it's just not anymore. And combine that with the fact that the story and the world of Starfield's nowhere near as interesting or as well thought out or as detailed as the lore-rich world of, say, Elder Scrolls, and what you've left with is basically a step back more than anything else. But that's the heart of my conflict, is I'm left with this sort of hollow feeling that it was a missed opportunity. You know, it was a chance for Bethesda to reinvent the wheel with a new IP where there was less expectation on what a game looked like compared to, you know, Elder Scrolls 6, for example, where there will be an expectation of there are certain things that an Elder Scrolls game does. This was a chance for them to throw a lot of those tropes out and innovate. I think that this has been quite cathartic for me, basically, to get all this off my chest. And I think now that the dust has settled a bit, my sort of headline takeaway from Starfield is that it is a missed opportunity.